Jon Paulien, chair of the School of Religion at Loma University, has been my friend for many years. He has been a Revelation scholar of this church for nearly 30 years. That was obvious from this morning's presentation. He has thought about this book a long time. He has a very special pastoral sense of his role as a religion professor, and it comes across in this essay. Paulien sets the agenda for his essay by describing it as a discussion about what Revelation 13 says about the papacy and how Adventists should relate to this information today. He sets this within a context of what he calls Catholic bashing and the postmodern rejection of harsh criticism of any ethnic, cultural, racial, or religious group. He posits that such bashing turns people away from the hearing of the gospel and Advent message rather than opening minds. Paulien lays out what he sees as the typical Adventist understanding of Revelation 13, with focus on the 1260-day-year prophecy, the deadly wound in the 19th century and its restoration in 1929, and the United States as the land beast. The article then shifts to a section titled Learning from Evangelism. Paulien describes what some Adventists do with the above end-time scenario. He notes that they feel compelled to share the information, making it even the center of their outreach, while others have focused on the attractiveness of Jesus, saving the more condemnatory aspects of Adventist teaching for private settings. Paulien shares a personal experience from his early days in ministry in New York City, and I just can't imagine that conference president who wouldn't warn a young pastor. As a young pastor, he shared the above information in a public setting and lost the Catholics who were coming to the meetings. Bravely, he went to visit them, and one individual shared with him that the information shared in the meeting wasn't good history because it was based on information other than the decisions and councils and the ex cathedra statements of the Pope. That is the official basis of Catholic teaching. Paulien indicates that what he had done in the evangelistic meeting would be similar to assuming that all Adventists are like David Koresh. Paulien argues that the negative messages of Revelation 13 have played a central role in much Adventist evangelism in the last century. But he notes that they are not part of the 28 fundamental beliefs of the church. He argues that Revelation 13 is not at the core of what it means to be an Adventist Christian. He sees sharing the message of Revelation 13 as having two functions: setting a boundary marker for those who need clarity, and as an important evangelistic strategy in some places. This leads Paulien to lay out what he sees as the history of the evangelistic approach he decries. It is in a section titled How Adventists Decided to Call Out the Papacy. He didn't give you all the titles. He describes the population of the United States from the time of independence up through the 19th century. He states that the country was largely made up of people of Northern and Western European origin, with a lot fewer Catholics than today. He depicts the anti-Catholic sentiments of that time and notes that around the turn of the 20th century, an Adventist evangelist named Simpson took advantage of the anti-Catholic bias by giving large press to Revelation 13 in order to draw Protestants to the Adventist church. Paulien then fast forwards to the present day and indicates that the strategy no longer works because of a shift in viewpoint regarding how one speaks regarding people of other faiths. He argues that presenting negative information about Catholicism plays into negative stereotypes of Christianity as a whole. He notes that young Adventists meeting Catholics find them to be quite different from what they have been taught about the Catholic Church. This entire perspective on the postmodern setting leads Paulien to wonder if it is really necessary to share Revelation 13 with people today. This question leads Paulien to his final few sections that share ideas from an article in the Adventist Review by Shane Anderson, Jon's own experience in an interfaith dialogue with Lutherans, where he was asked to present on Revelation 13, and finally some thoughts from the Voice of Prophecy evangelist John Boostra. Anderson shares 4 ideas in his article for presenting the information about the beast to remove focus from human beings to God: 2, because it is true; 3, because the message liberates people; and 4, because Jesus is coming again. The personal experience Paulien shares with the interfaith dialogue is probably the most striking part of his paper. It delineates the sharp reaction from a German theologian and how another scholar was able to bridge the gap by speaking of how much learning and sharing had taken place between the two groups, and should it be all thrown away over one point. Paulien goes on to share how he spoke directly to the concerned Lutheran, drawing a circle that took in both the Lutheran and the Adventists in concern for our children and grandchildren not to go astray from the truths of the gospel. This leads to Paulien's sharing of how Jon Boonstra lays out Revelation 13. It is to speak of the sea beast as the Christian church of the Middle Ages, the all of us back then, Christianity owning its dirty laundry and decrying its evil. Paulien sees this as a way to take the blame off God and remove the we-them mentality in our presentations. He also sees it opening the way for people to be ready for the end-time crisis that Revelation 13 predicts. In closing, Paulien warns that any message that offers a criticism of others, however true, can easily draw out the worst in those who proclaim it. It is the triumphalism of we are better, wiser than you mentality. Paulien argues that Revelation 13 is also for Adventists, and that it needs to be shared in a wider biblical framework to place it in proper perspective. That's my summary of the paper. Now, my critique. The postmodern setting. As always, Jon Paulien is thoughtful in what he writes. His discussion is not an examination of opposing scholarly views on the interpretation of the apocalypse, but rather a scholar reflecting on how to share the Adventist message about Revelation 13 with the world around us. It is clear to me that his intent is to move forward the discussion of our outreach to the world within the challenging setting of postmodern Western society. And for that, I want to say thank you very much. Very thoughtful piece. To my mind, postmodernism provides both a blessing and a curse to our world. First, the blessing is that it challenges every viewpoint and insists that we recognize the context and biases from which we speak. This type of critique is always helpful in that it insists on an objective look at oneself as one purports to speak about what is observed. Every one of us has a perspective, a background story that impacts, guides, and colors the way we see the world around us and how we report it to others. That is the blessing, a call for a sense of humility about my knowledge base and how I present it, recognizing my own background, my own perspective and story that colors my understanding and expression. But postmodernism, or its impact on society, also presents us with a curse. It is the curse of PCism that insists that all viewpoints are valid. There is no truth at the core of anything. It is all a matter of opinions, flavors, preferences. This type of perspective finds expression in a phrase such as, "It is right for me, but I don't know if it is right for you." The philosophical problem with this type of viewpoint is that it insists on the veracity of a proposition that all is relative, which is a contradiction of logic if the very proposition is a verity. Postmodernism uses logic to deconstruct truth, but one cannot deconstruct without some sort of logic by which to function. It seems to me that this societal milieu leads to quite fuzzy thinking by some, perhaps many people, particularly regarding ethics. Rather than argue and consider the logic of ideas, an appeal is made to tolerance of all views. Logic, critical thinking, and facing one's own failures are the victims of this curse. Come Adventist evangelism and the clear delineation of Christianity in the Middle Ages as the sea beast of Revelation 13, with all the evils of oppression and false doctrines, one can almost sense a perfect storm between postmodernism's insistence on tolerance and the Adventist insistence on what Revelation 13 is all about. This conjunction of opposites, along with a number of experiences of failure to reach people, is what attracts Paulien's attention and leads to his proposals. Let me address a number of Paulien's points and then ask a few questions for our discussion time. First, the Adventist view. Paulien lays out, I think fairly accurately, the Adventist teaching about Revelation 13. We are all well acquainted with the details found in much Adventist literature. However, Paulien places this in a context that he describes as Catholic bashing and proceeds to share experiences where the outcome seemed to be just that, turning off Catholic listeners and ending their attendance at meetings. Such experiences are tragic and painful. I applaud John's desire to avoid what Ellen White called cutting off the listener's ears. I don't know if you've ever read that in her writing. She talks about cutting off their ears, offending them with present truth by sharing it at the wrong time without the soil properly prepared. And now listening again tonight to John, after I've read this and worked on it and read it, I'm impressed with how many times he talked about how you present it, when you present it, in what context you present it. What I fear here, however, is a rather broad stroke, at least at the beginning of the article, that tends to paint the Adventist view in general as rooted in an intolerant perspective that looks down on all others and sets out to manipulate them into the church. While there may be some shady characters in Adventist evangelism whose motives do not bear the light of day, I do not think it fair to paint the majority or their motives in that light. Since Jon highlights various personal experiences in the paper, I trust it was not his intention to suggest that all Adventist evangelism that shares the message of Revelation 13, even in rather clear detail, falls within that category. Good history and Catholic teaching. When Paulien shares the story of the Catholics who stopped attending his meetings in New York, he reports how one of the Catholics said that what he was sharing was not good history. The Catholic then proceeded to indicate that Catholic teaching is defined or known only by the decisions of church councils and the ex cathedra statements of the Pope. Jon appears to accept this definition at face value. While I agree that Catholic doctrine is established by the councils and the Pope, it seems to me that looking at doctrine alone is insufficient. The Catholic Church is not known simply by what it teaches, but especially by what it does and has done in the past, as is true of every church. To look only at the teaching is to miss whether or not the Catholic Church abides by what it says. We know all too well from human experience that the two may not always coincide. The Catholic was right to critique a shallow presentation of what the Catholic Church stands for. But there exists much data and details that tie the sea beast of Revelation 13 to the Church. The most striking include the Bishop of Rome filling the power vacuum when Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople, and the later centuries-long use of the forged document known as the Donation of Constantine to support the temporal power of the Church. Who ever would have thought that the capital of the empire would shift away from Rome, and that the words of the Donatio, written centuries later, would echo almost verbatim the statements of Revelation 13? And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. If you haven't read the Donatio lately, take a look. Revelation 13 and the 28 fundamental beliefs. Paulien argues that the negative messages of Revelation 13 are not part of the 28 fundamental beliefs of the Adventist Church. Technically, it is correct that the sea beast and the land beast of Revelation 13 are not mentioned specifically in any of the 28 beliefs. I will note that Revelation 13:8 is noted as one of the Bible texts in belief number 10 on salvation, of all things. However, as above, when describing Catholicism, a church's doctrines do not completely define a church. The apocalyptic visions of Revelation, particularly chapters 12 to 14, have played a foundational role in the life and theology of the Adventist Church, even going back to the days of the early Millerites, before the Adventist Church was even officially organized. Furthermore, the sea beast of Revelation 13 is alluded to in the fundamental belief number 13, the remnant and its mission, in which the following words appear. The universal church is composed of all who truly believe in Christ. A nice inclusive statement. But in the last days, a time of widespread apostasy, a remnant has been called out to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. This remnant announces the arrival of the judgment hour, proclaims salvation through Christ, and heralds the approach of his second advent. Certainly the reference to apostasy is a description of the sea beast's activity. This claim is corroborated by the list of texts supporting this doctrine, including Revelation 14:6-12 and 18:1-4. These verses have a clear linkage to Revelation 13. So it seems to me that the sea beast of Revelation 13 cannot be divorced from the fundamental beliefs of the Adventist Church. Lastly, new approaches and the challenges of postmodern mindsets. While we could discuss any of the above items, I am more interested in considering together just how the apocalyptic message of Revelation can best be addressed to a postmodern setting, which is what I hear Jon raising in his article. We are an apocalyptic people with a prophetic message centered in the great controversy vision of Revelation 12 to 14. Prophets are rarely popular with people because of their message of rebuke for prevailing evils. So let me ask two questions. First, in a postmodern setting, using we in place of us, them appears much more inclusive and welcoming. It seems there's some very positive things there. But my question is, how does one place this within the setting of church history without playing fast and loose with the details of disagreements and splits and consequent opposing viewpoints on central issues? Would Luther call it we? Should we? Second, Within a stance of we, as those who are critiqued by Revelation 13, does this blur the lines between the people of God and those who dwell on the earth, as Revelation calls the wicked? Surely Revelation 2-3 addresses sin among the saints, but Revelation 13, does it? I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shepard, for your reaction. And maybe the two questions were asked. Would you like to respond right away, Dr. Paulien?
Well, I would like him to come up with me and we just talk about it a little
please.
bit.
Let's do it.
This is a proposal I'm learning myself very much along the way. I want to go back to page 4 where you talked about painting the Adventist view as
my
intolerant.
4 or your 4?
It's your 4,
Okay.
yeah. In the second paragraph you talk about I use a broad brushstroke to paint the Adventist view in general as rooted in an intolerant perspective. I'm probably guilty of using language that allowed that impression. That was not my intention. What I was not assuming that I was being intolerant with those old Catholics. I was just trying to give the message, and I tried to give it in a caring, etc. way. My point there was simply that even at the wrong time and the wrong place, it comes across as Catholic bashing,
Oh, yes.
and it comes across as intolerant no matter how you do it. So that was my point, and if that helps clarify,
Yeah,
or you can come back at me.
It was interesting. I read your paper, and I made all these notes along the side, as I usually do when I'm reading papers. And it was like the first part of the paper, I was like, no, 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 no. And then I got toward the end of the paper, I was sort of like, oh yes, this is really good, you know. Oh yes, oh, this story with the Lutherans, this is really great, you know. And when you got to the end, I was like, oh, that's very nice. But I felt almost like it was, I felt like there was like a dichotomy between the first part and the last half of it. And maybe it was just the way you were trying to be, I think, probably very sort of clinical in describing Adventism. You're sort of like stepping back and describing it. The Adventists take it this way, the Adventists take it that way. And I just sort of, that Adventism in me just sort of responded, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you, because you know, if it came across even to one person that I was saying the message itself is inherently intolerant, you know, I'm glad to be called on that, and I can rethink the way that I present that. Yeah.
I mean, I very much when I teach Revelation here, and I talk to the students, and I talk about Revelation 13 in detail, and I say, look, you must be very careful how you present this. I'm very much along the lines of, look, be careful. This must not be made hate literature. This is not hate literature, and you must not make it hate literature by the way you present it. I learned from an evangelist. It looks like you've had your own personal experiences, and you've learned from evangelists and everything. I learned from evangelists that one of the best times to present Revelation 13 is on the Sabbath morning. You're doing an evangelistic series, and you don't present it until it's at church on Sabbath morning, because there's certain people that won't come. Why offend them unnecessarily? Wait until Sabbath morning when they've already made a commitment to come to church on Sabbath. And, you know, you've kind of stated it in terms of doing it in private settings, and I appreciate that.
You see, really, we're both New Testament scholars, but tonight, that's not what we're talking about. Tonight, we're both missionaries.
Yes.
And we've both been missionaries, yes. And that's the focus, I think, and I like what you said.
Now, yeah. I am interested in you responding to the whole thing about the we.
Right.
You know, I like this inclusion thing, but I'm kind of wondering, now I'm almost speaking more as a New Testament scholar, where do you see the we in Revelation 13? Isn't the we over there, I mean, it really, isn't it the beast in Revelation 13, and isn't it the three angels in Revelation 14? And how can you preach the three angels' messages without talking about Revelation 13?
Yeah, well, that's how we've read it. You're absolutely right. And I'm just raising the question, is that the way God wants us to read it today? And let me just offer a couple of little vignettes from Adventist history that may give some perspective. Mm-hmm. I do, by the way, have several pages of quotations from Ellen White saying many of the things I said tonight. I didn't include them simply because of time.
Yes.
But let me just say this. You look at Ellen White's ministry. Where is the bashing? it's almost exclusively of other Adventists.
Yes.
Testimonies to the Church, 9 volumes. Great Controversy is the one place where you over 7 volumes, you get this significant element, and she changes it quite a bit in 1911, and was thinking about changing it even further, but was concerned that if she changed it too much, it would look wishy-washy, as I hear from white estate people. So she herself saved her harshest statements for her fellow believers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, put that together with one other fact that I learned from the Oxford biography that recently came out that I think is very significant. In that, there was a chapter on her public meetings, Ellen White as a speaker. And the author went through all of her sermons to non-Adventist audiences. She never once spoke of any Adventist distinctive. She spoke about Jesus, she spoke about temperance, alcohol, things like that, but she always sought the common ground with every audience. That's kind of interesting to me. She saves her harshest condemnations for her fellow believers, and when she's in the presence of Catholics, and even on one occasion she said it was a Catholic, you probably know this, it was a Catholic that convinced her to stop eating meat. It was in 1896, 30 years after the vision. She was still eating occasionally oysters and other things. And it was a Roman Catholic lady that came up to her and said, have you ever considered the animals and how they suffer to provide your meat? And Ellen White says, I was struck to the heart. This Catholic woman was a messenger of God to me, and I determined from that day forward never to touch another piece of meat. So those are some vignettes from Ellen White's own story that make me ask the question, have we read this Us Against Them? Have we read Revelation right? And that's not an assertion, that's a question. And I value your questioning it because I want to keep thinking about that.
I guess I'm thinking exegetically in terms of Revelation 13 and 14. The beast is not the people of God. Revelation 2, there's a lot of critique of the people of God. And so that's fine. And I suppose Boonstra in his, taking on the sins of Israel in Daniel 9, that's very helpful. But it's still not the beast of Revelation 13.
Well, that is Boonstra, and I'm very intrigued by it. I'm not 100% sure I buy it, but I think for me, it was the best approach in a postmodern context that I'd heard.
I remember my daughter, who was a biologist, talking about this, and she heard him, and she said, I feel very comfortable with that.
Yeah.
She had studied at Notre Dame, at a Catholic university, and she felt very comfortable with that kind of expression for her Catholic friends. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think you have to be really wise.
Yeah.
I completely agree in how you do it. No, you want to stop?
I think it's time also to give our audience some chance.
Actually, Tom, it's to both of you, so if you wouldn't mind. My question is
your
this.
turn to get a little criticism.
Well, my question is this.
Sure.
When we read Revelation 13 only as other, rather than reading it as a critique of ourselves, are we disallowing the possibility that we have something to be cleaned up that is beast-like in ourselves? In other words, if you make a hard and fast us, them from Revelation 13 and 14, then is there anything in Revelation 13 that we can learn about that might prompt us to let God change us?
Oh, well, it's always a warning to the world. I certainly agree. It's always a warning to all. Every person is part of this great controversy. My point is that Revelation 13 is presented in a rather stark picture of those who are not dedicated to God, those who do not follow the Lamb. And I think every Christian says, I'm a follower of the Lamb. I want to follow the Lamb.
What John just said, though, does remind me, you asked the question, would Luther say we?
I don't think so.
And I'm reminded of Luther's own comment where he said, in my mind, the most dangerous pope of all is Pope's self.
Oh, so.
So, anyway.
Yeah.
All
No,
right,
I'm thinking exegetically in terms of these two chapters. I think there's a
I
there's
just
like
exegeted Luther.
a clear mark between the two.
Right, Dr. Gaines?
I've got a comment and a question. My comment is that I think you're both right. That's kind of rabbinic, I guess. That's my background. But because there's a clear contrast there in both Revelation and in Daniel between the two groups. But what we're talking about is missiology and our own growth. And the missiological aspect that I'm hearing Dr. Paulien talk about in relation to Sean Boonstra is we're wanting to move with people rather than against them in the direction of the right group that's there in clear contrast in Revelation. Does that make sense?
Sure.
That's my comment. My question is this. In talking about the basic fundamental beliefs of the church in relation to Revelation 13, can we really separate Revelation 13 from Daniel 8? And Daniel 8 is presenting one of the pillars from the very beginning, and that is the concept of what Christ is doing now in his heavenly sanctuary from the 2300 days. And can we do that without identifying the same power that we have to identify in Revelation 13? And if so, if we must identify it that way, then do you have any advice for us on how we can do that more tactfully? I'm coming at it from the angle of Daniel because that's where I work primarily. So can you help us with presenting Daniel 8 more tactfully and more missiologically?
Yeah, my response to the Daniel 8 question is that all scholars agree that Revelation 13 is thoroughly grounded in Daniel 7. I'm not aware of any scholar that says it's grounded in Daniel 8. I think that there's possibility of Daniel 8 behind some of the sanctuary material in Revelation that you've heard me give in class. Revelation 13 does not ground itself in Daniel 8, so I would not automatically make the assumption if that's central, then the other needs to be also. And Tom, you make a good point. Revelation 13 is listed in a list of texts under one fundamental, and there's this reference to apostasy. But I hardly think anybody reading through the fundamental beliefs will get the kind of picture you get in the evangelistic meeting.
That may be true, but like I said, I don't think that the doctrines, the statement of the doctrines, either of the Catholic Church or of the Adventist Church, tells you all about the church and what it's about, and who the people are, and how they present themselves. So I don't see that. I felt as though your paper kind of was separating it out a little bit too much, and not owning our history. I do, this thing about the people as the follower of the lambs. To me, one of the great things to probably think about on this issue is to assume that anybody that comes to our meetings is a follower of the Lamb and wants to follow Jesus more closely. I'm reminded of a Daniel seminar starting with Daniel chapter 1 and with the young men standing up for God over an issue of food of all things. And are you willing to, are you brave enough to put your life on the line to follow the truths that God shows to you, even the little things? And when people start thinking along those lines, yes, I want to follow Jesus, I want to do it, then you're moving them together with them. We're all going together to follow the Lamb, and you stay away from, it's us, them.
All right, now the voice from above, over there.
I always have a question, Dr. Paulien, and in your book, you presented the everlasting gospel in our changing world. You present concern about postmodernism and how the world is changing. But I see that we as Adventists, we explain Revelation 13 and the book of Revelation in a very religious way, and the world is changing more and more to non-religious, and also Hinduism and other religions have been growing, and they are not Catholics at all. How do we put them in our discussion about the marketplace in Revelation 13?
Okay, well, Revelation 13, on the face of it, does not seem to be addressing non-Christian religions that I can see. It is speaking about the enemy at the end of time as having a Christian face, as a follower of Jesus. So how we relate to non-Christian religions can be a separate issue. And I think Ellen White's guidance and good missiological principles would suggest that you begin with the points that you have in common and then seek to see how Scripture might speak to the heartfelt needs of those other religions. But I don't see Revelation 13 as directly addressing those religions. I have had the privilege of sharing Revelation 13 with Muslim scholars, and I did find it interesting that they seem to pick up exegetical approach quicker than seminary students did. And it startled me, and then I realized that in a real sense Muslims look at Revelation without 2,000 years of Christian reading and interpretation and tradition.
And
They're kind of isolated from that.
And in 150 years of Adventist teaching.
Yeah, and they're looking at Revelation more from the first century perspective, the Hebraic kind of philosophy. So they seem to see very easily what was going on in the text, whereas when you're with a group of Adventists, you struggle to get through, to get back to the text through layers of what has been said about the text. So that to me is a challenge. But non-Christian religions, I think, can be addressed by these things, but it'll probably be in a different way than we address fellow Christians.
This is something I would like to respond to Tom.
Uh-oh.
I thought the same when I went to chapter 13. Evidently, it's only about the first and second beast. But there is something that amazes me, that always in the critical points in the book of Revelation, whenever that enemy power is addressed, it always concludes with the warning to the saints.
Mm-hmm.
This morning you talked, John, about those 3 frogs. But then suddenly we have 16:15 that is inserted there. It shows conduct. The same is in chapter 13. It's interesting, the description of the first beast does not conclude with the beast. It's in verse 10. The translators are struggling how to translate it. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. I always wonder, why is this inserted here? Evidently, there is something in the saints that they will be tempted
Yes.
to repeat the history of the first beast.
Sure.
And here is the warning. It's not only the patience, but it's faithfulness to Jesus Christ. And I believe that this is the text, just a unique text, two lines that really is inserted, evidently does not belong to chapter 13. But can you respond to that?
Oh, me or you?
You were talking to him? Yeah. My point would be to say yes to what you've said and point out that in Revelation 18 it explicitly states, "Come out of her, my people." So Revelation does not see the enemy power as solely evil, but it is being addressed and appealed to. That Revelation 13, in a sense, is a gospel that addresses and invites a response.
Now, it seems to me that the point here is to say to God's people as you are reading this, be careful that you are not tempted with the same. That's my. It's called to faithfulness.
I agree. I like it, and this can also link into the 3 angels' messages.
Of course.
Because the 3 angels' messages are to all those who dwell on the earth, which is the usual term for the wicked in the book. And what's interesting is that the first angel's message is a message of the gospel and of salvation, and the mirror image of that, or the dark image of that, is the second and third angel's messages, which reflect the message of damnation. What happens if you don't listen to the first angel? You get those. So that's the warning about the beasts of Revelation 13. So they are clearly on the wrong side, and the warning to the world is come back to God. And so, yeah, sure, a warning to all of us. I like what you said.
And then in verse 12 is the same words are inserted. Here is the patience of the saints
Yes.
who keep the commandments of God and faith. It's identical.
Very good. So, Dr. Joseph?
just a couple of simple observations. First of all, I think we can safely leave Catholic bashing to Catholics like Gary Wills, who do a much better job of it than we do. Secondly, I keep coming back to the only criterion of religious rightness that Jesus said so clearly, by their fruits you shall know them. And I kind of wonder whether at the end only those will find favor with God who are skillful and clever exegetes and those who accept what they say. Do you think that if people read Revelation 13 without any prior knowledge of the Adventist Pesher, they would make the same identifications that we do?
Well, this morning I tried to read Revelation without those presuppositions, just taking it on the face value, and I think when you read it that way, it's a powerful message to the reader to avoid those kinds of ways of thinking and doing. I think that if you read it exegetically and so on, that's one thing. If you read it as a devotional reader, there's a different message. Both of those are there in the text. And sometimes I guess Adventists miss the one, and maybe others would miss the other without some help.
All right, very good. So the last question from the back, please.
Yeah, I think we're going to do a chiasm here. I'm going back to the first question. I think the issue of us against them seems to be, we can be enlightened by looking once again to Revelation 12:17. I mean, we generally, as Adventists, connect ourselves or identify ourselves with the remnant. But the text actually says that the dragon was enraged against the woman and the remnant of her offspring. And of course, we identify the woman with the Christian church through the ages. I wonder if we can look at the text and say, well, the woman is Christianity in January, and the remnant is some kind of a group with special identification and mission. If maybe it could help us or inform us to not have this kind of dialogue where it's asking us against them, but really the dragon is enraged against all of us, and we have to make a decision at the end.
I just had a good thought and I just lost it. Speak for a minute while I think again.
Here's, to me, the great challenge, one of the great challenges in the postmodern setting. See, the postmodern setting wants tolerance of everything. And Revelation is very clear, black and white. I mean, there's these two sides. There's the dichotomies throughout the book. There's always evil versus good. And somehow to think with people, to come to the place where you recognize there is good and there is evil, is one of the key issues in reaching. Now, how you do that, you just can't throw a black and white book at somebody who only sees gray, because they'll just throw it away because it doesn't even address them. Somehow we have to think of how to become their friends, that they can actually sense good and evil again.
Well, here's a little nuance, and you hinted at it in your response. When the book of Revelation addresses the church, there's great flaws and great danger.
As I said,
when it addresses Babylon, there's godly people in it.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's not as black and white as we've read it. And a part of my point here is the way that we have read it completely and truly the right way, or could we reread in the guidance of the Spirit?
I guess I'd have to say, I appreciate the point. It's a good point. Mm-hmm. I'd have to say there is a very strong sense throughout the book of there's right and there's wrong. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a standard by mm-hmm. which all of these people, all of us, failed, making mistakes all the time, mm-hmm. are judged. Mm-hmm. And I go back to what Bob said, you're judged by your deeds. So it's not what you say, it's what you do. And so are the people going to eventually end up with the Lamb? There's no in between the lake of fire in the heavenly city. You're in or you're out. All I want to be is in the last house on Z Street.
One last word, and I want to address it to Dr. Shepard here. I appreciate your response very much. It was very kind and very thoughtful, and I will read it with care and I will pray over it, and this is my commitment to you. If after doing so, I come to the conclusion that you are right on all these things, I will buy and wear a bow tie.
Well, with that good humor, we are ending this very serious